So moving on to the first session of the day, our motivational speaker, I'm really excited to be able to introduce Dr. Gita Sen. And Gita is online, and I think you can see her camera. And she's also requested if people could please turn on their camera as well, so she could get a sense of the people that she will be talking to. So I'd just like to introduce her briefly, because I don't want to eat up too much into the time that she will inspire us, but really just to say that Gita has over 40 years of experience working internationally and nationally on gender equality and women's human rights. She's got a very strong feminist activist background. She was actually one of the members of the women's rights movement that gave impetus to the changes in the International Conference on Population and Development Program of Action, and also the Beijing Platform for Action. So that's, she's been around working for a very long time in this area. She is also the founder and coordinator of the Southern Feminist Network called DAWN, which stands for Development Alternatives for Women for a New Era. She's a citizen of India and holds a PhD in economics from Stanford University. So she's actually an economist by training. And her current role, after many other roles, is currently the Distinguished Professor and Director at the Public Health Foundation of India. And she was previously for many years a professor of public policy at the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore, and also an adjunct professor of global health and population at the Harvard School of Public Health. So there's no way I can do justice to all the other international positions and national positions she's held, but just to also say that she's very widely published as an author of journal articles and books. She's received several prizes, and she holds several honorary doctorates from many prestigious universities. So we're really fortunate to have her here today, and I'm sure she will have many valuable insights to share with us from her personal and professional background. But just to start with, Gita has asked me to just show a little brief video, and after that, she will launch straight into her talk. So over to Ma to start the video, and then over to you, Gita. Thank you.
Good morning, ma'am. Good morning. How nice to meet all of you. No. It's only... I never worked, so I had all the energy, even to do it at the age of 67. I just wanted to get out and meet people.
How old were you?
1948, this is Goa.
You had just washed your hair.
Yes. First of all, I myself had all these aspirations. I wanted to become a doctor and look after the sick people. But in those days, the girls had very limited rights. But this thing, half the dream is being fulfilled, isn't it? I am helping these children who have no other this thing. I have to be satisfied with that, isn't it? Say, I am very happy the way women who want to come up, they have their independence, because we don't have any Y chromosome in our house. I have 3 daughters, 5 granddaughters, 2 great-granddaughters. The youngest great-granddaughter, she beats everybody. Let me see what God thinks, Every night I pray, God, let me not get up tomorrow morning. Every morning I get up, make my coffee, so that is it. Whatever God wills, that's it, nothing else. And I'm very happy with my family.
The floor is yours, Gita.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. Good morning or good evening or good afternoon or whatever it is to everyone. I'm here just to, I'm supposed to motivate and inspire you. And I'm really, it was a bit of an awesome responsibility. So I needed to break it down in my own head to something that I felt I could do. So I feel I'm here just to share some thoughts and some experiences from my life as an academic, as an activist, as an advocate for gender equality and women's rights. So let me just launch into it. I was probably around a year old, 1 year, when my mother, I was born right around the India's independence from British rule. And normally my mother would have gone down to the village. We lived at that time not far from Mumbai in the west coast of India. She would have gone down to the deep south of India to the village where her mother lived in order to have me. But because of independence, there was a lot of unrest and so on. So they decided it wasn't safe for her to travel by train. And so I was born in the town. And then when I was a little, probably about 6, 7, 8, I don't know, 9 months old, my mother discovered she was expecting another baby. And the thought of having two so close to each other and so young was a bit too much. So I was basically bundled up and carried off to live with my grandmother in the village, deep in the south of India, almost at the southern tip. In a village surrounded by paddy fields, the blue hills of the Nilgiris, monkeys all over the place, to be raised by my grandmother for the next 3 years or so. For me, it was obviously an idyllic time because I was the only little one around. Everybody spoiled me completely, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. But you know, I don't know if you have that experience of some flashback vignettes from when you were very young that stay in your mind or stay in your memory very sharply. So I have this memory of paddy fields and hills, but among the things that I have a very strong memory of was my beloved grandmother, who was a widow. She was a young widow. She was widowed at the age of 36. My grandfather died all of a sudden of an appendix problem, and left my grandmother with 7 children to be raised. The eldest of whom my mother had been married off by then, but she basically had to raise these 6 other children, 4 more daughters to marry, because that was what was seen as what you did with daughters in those days, and then 2 sons to raise, to educate, to have them stand on their own feet, etc. My grandmother clearly led a very stressful life. And it wasn't made easier by the fact that as an upper caste woman, she couldn't even go out to earn a living. That would be considered outside the caste boundaries. So she survived and raised her children by selling her jewelry, her gold jewelry, piece by piece, selling the land she had, which wasn't a whole lot, again, little by little, just in order to survive. But more than anything else, in those days in India, widows were seen as a bad omen. Widows shouldn't be seen. So my grandmother couldn't leave her own home to go out from the front door. She would have to go from the back door. And if especially a man came to visit for something, to buy a piece of land or something else, she would stand behind the door and speak to him from there as he sat on a chair or divan in the living area. And that's a very striking image that has stayed with me. Of course, in those days, what did I understand? Children tend to be really self-centered anyway, and I had no idea what this was all about, or why my grandmother would quickly get up and go stand behind the door if someone came to ring the doorbell. Cut to my mother's life. My grandmother, by the way, had been married at the age of 9. I do believe later on, and she lived to the ripe age of 91. I do believe if my grandmother had lived in a more gender equal world, she would have made a great diplomat and been one of India's foreign service officers. She was brilliant at languages, taught herself multiple languages that she could read and write in. She wrote beautiful letters. She could interact with people who were highly sophisticated, educated, as someone who just by reading and absorbing and thinking on her own, felt herself comfortable and confident enough to be able to do that. She was a remarkable person. Cut to my mother. My mother had been married at the age of 14. She had a bit more time than my grandmother. And she had finished or almost finished high school at the time. And that, of course, was the end of her education. She didn't have 7 children. She had the 3 of us, all three girls. And she, but she essentially was a homemaker. She raised us. She learned English from us, as she's always said. And as I think about my mother, the one thing my mother, who has always wanted to be in her life, is a doctor. Again, in a gender equal world, she would have made a brilliant doctor. I know because, of her deep interest. And she would read these huge tomes about, cancer or the finding of a new cure for something right into her later years. She learned French just in order to have something to do. And this is someone who had been taken out of formal education by the age of 14. That was my mother, by the way, who you saw in that video. She's still going strong. That video was taken about a year back. And at the age of 67, when my father died, she decided to start teaching. And that's the first time that she actually sort of began developing a career. These are, obviously growing up, I was aware of these things, but not really consciously aware of them. But they imprinted themselves in me. And I've learned what I think I would call my first lesson for you from this. Who we are and what we become depends on 3 things. First of all, obviously, whatever intrinsic qualities we come with. For instance, even if I wanted to, I couldn't become a great pianist or a great painter. I just don't have it in me. I have other qualities. So our intrinsic qualities are what we come into the world with. Then, very importantly, it's what we are given and what happens to us. What caste we belong to, what economic opportunities we have, what education we're able to get, how social and economic inequalities, where they place us in the world, and what happens in the world around us. Our children, as we know, and grandchildren, hopefully, but will have to live with climate change, which we are beginning, only beginning to see the start of. And the third, however, is, and most important thing, is what we make or do with these. And I think for both my mother and my grandmother, that's the thing that I learned from their lives. Gender inequality trapped them in a lot of ways, but they weren't sort of pushed down and out by that. They decided they wouldn't give their remote control to somebody else, and they would do the best that they could under the circumstances of their lives to make the best of the opportunities they had, the things they had. So for me, that is a first life lesson that has been very important in guiding me and holding my hand through life. The second one is something I learned as I grew up. As I became a teenager and went on from there, I learned the importance of seeing beyond myself. And this started affecting many things in my life. I consciously stopped being the self-centered baby, child, growing adolescent that I'd been, and started paying attention to the world around me. And I want to say that it's from that period that a passion for justice, for fairness, a compassion for those who are down and out began sort of becoming an important driver in my life. It, in a sense, became what shaped many things in my life. My work choices, in a sense, you could say paths, as the Latin Americans do, paths are made by walking. And for me, there were multiple choices that I made at that time. I studied economics, but I was not satisfied with standard economics. So I went back to study classical political economy, even though there were no jobs to be had there. The World Bank wasn't going to hire me for doing that, but it was something that I felt I really needed to do in order to understand. My first job, I quit because I was not happy with it and moved to a second job with much lower pay, simply because it seemed more interesting and exciting, and because it would give me the opportunity to work with underprivileged college students. And I've never regretted doing that. Both my husband and I were studying and working at that time in the US. And my third big choice of this kind, the choice we made together, was to come back to India. At a time when, in fact, when we started telling people that's what we're going to do, everyone was sort of shocked. What? You're going to leave the land of milk and honey and go back to an underdeveloped country, as it was considered at that time? And we said, yes, for our work, that's what makes sense. That's what we're going to do. And we'll take our chances. We'll see what happens. We've got a lot going for us. What's the point of having a PhD or this or that and so on, if we can't then figure out a way to make things work in the land from which we've come and to which we want to give back? I think that it's very important to follow your heart. And for me, to following my inner voice, following my heart, so to speak, has been really, really important. I don't want to call myself a leader, but I do believe that a good leader seldom sets out to be a leader. In fact, if you find somebody saying, see, I'm so great, like the former president of the United States, see, I'm a leader, what a great leader I am, I'm the best in this and that, you can be almost certain they're not. A good leader, the good comes from wanting to do things to affect others for the better, to help with other people's lives. And I think following one's heart and one's inner voice is crucial for doing that. The third point I want to make, and this one has really been very important in guiding choices in my life going forward. By the way, I should say coming back to India wasn't easy. I'd gotten used to the freedom of being a woman in the US and being a woman from India. So I didn't fall into the limits of being a woman, an American woman in the US. I was an Indian woman in the US, and so there were no rules for that. So I could pretty much do and be whatever I wanted. Coming back to India wasn't easy at all. And I remember when my husband and I were looking for work, one interview in particular, we were sitting across the desk from someone who was looking to hire us, a man, of course. I would ask a question and he would turn to my husband as though he had asked the question and give him the answer. It was as though he couldn't make eye contact with me. And I was coming back into this kind of patriarchal mindset and setup. And I had many, many, many challenges with it after living as a relatively quote unquote free woman in the United States and in New York, of all things. Finally, I think the big thing for me, as my work began to have influence, is to realize how much I depended and depend on others, on the work of others, on the generosity of others, on the willingness to work together of others. And in a sense, I think that's the core of what I consider to be feminist values. To be able to have and work with people, women and men sometimes, with energy, with motivation, with enthusiasm, with the willingness to take on difficult challenges, to help and support each other, to overcome challenges, surmount challenges, I think has been the joy of my life. It doesn't mean you don't fight with them sometimes. It doesn't mean you don't disagree, and there are disagreements, but it does mean, and it doesn't mean that you won't get betrayed sometimes, but it does mean that you keep coming back to that, because in a sense, it is the ground that keeps on giving you the energy to keep addressing the difficulties and challenges that being someone working for gender equality and women's rights confronts you with all of the time. If I were to draw a leadership lesson from this, and as I said, I don't claim to be a leader, but a leadership lesson from this would be that a good leader empowers followers, must inspire, must support, must promote, and very importantly, know when to get out of the way, to allow those around to be able to shine, to stand out, to come into their own. In fact, you could argue that a good leader, a leader is known by their followers. And that's very important, because remember, there's a lot of bad leaders in the world. After all, Hitler was a leader par excellence. But all you had to do, even if you were deaf and blind to whatever Hitler was doing and saying, you would only have to look at his followers and what they were doing to know that this could not be a good leader. This is not somebody who was working for the well-being of others. This was someone who was a narcissist full of himself. So the difference between a bad leader and a good leader is the difference between being a narcissist, where everything is about I, me, myself, and being able to get out of the way and allow people to come forward. So you might say, listen, but you've lived the life of an academic, as an activist, as an advocate. What do you have specifically to say for us who may not be any of those things? Instead of academic, just replace that with thinker. That is, think all the time about where you are, where you're trying to go, what you're trying to do, and be reflexive about what, self-reflexive about what you can learn. Sometimes it's difficult, it's unpleasant to confront one's own mistakes, but they are the best teachers. So thinking is something everyone can do rather than avoiding thinking. Second, as an activist, you're a doer. Everybody is a doer in their lives. What kind of doing it is, and whether you set out to be a leader or you set out simply to have compassion and to work for fairness and justice, you can be a doer. And finally, an advocate is a change maker. And all of you, I know, have it in your power and probably already do make change where you are. And I think that that's one of the most important things that the world needs. Above all, let me end by reminding you of what I said, which is to follow your heart, follow your inner voice. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your comments and questions.